Mississippi, 1835. The air was thick enough to taste, sweet with magnolia, bitter with the rot of secrets. At the edge of Wilkinson County, a sprawling plantation stood like a monument to ambition. Its owner, Isaiah Jessup, was a man of numbers, a man who believed profit was the same as purpose. But behind those white columns and polished ledgers, he was about to build something monstrous, a system that would twist generations of men into instruments of control. They called it the breeding operation. For 23 years, the Jessup family treated human life as capital, recorded, valued, and multiplied with the precision of a ledger. When the Civil War ended, the evidence vanished: burned papers, sealed vaults, silent witnesses. Until a locked trunk was found in 1962, filled with Isaiah's ledgers. Every line, a birth; every name, a price; every child, property. This isn't myth, it's history, and it's darker than fiction dares to go. Tonight, we open the Jessup ledgers and walk through the gates of the plantation history tried to forget. Before we step into that world, take a second. This story isn't entertainment, it's a reckoning. If stories like this matter to you, the ones history buried and only truth can resurrect, then subscribe and stay with us. Because what you're about to hear will haunt you, but it will also remind you why remembering matters. Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. And now, let's go back to Mississippi, where one man turned men into numbers. The year was 1835, and the Mississippi sun hung heavy over Wilkinson County like judgment itself. Isaiah Jessup stood at the edge of his land, sweat on his brow, staring across fields that whispered of wealth and ruin. He was 31, a man carved from ambition, raised to see numbers as gospel. The land he inherited wasn't just soil to him. It was a ledger, every furrow a line waiting to be filled with value. Isaiah had no children then, only dreams of legacy. He watched enslaved men moving in the distance, their backs bent beneath sacks of cotton, and felt something cold stir behind his eyes: calculation. He believed in systems, in structure. Men, he thought, were machines that could be tuned for perfection. And if that perfection created profit, then what was morality but an inconvenience of weaker minds? At night, Isaiah sat in his study, candlelight flickering over rows of numbers. He was haunted not by ghosts, but by inefficiency, by the idea that death, disease, and exhaustion drained his investment faster than he could replace it. He began writing formulas, crude ratios comparing cost and yield, man-hours and output. He wasn't thinking of cruelty, he was thinking of control. And control, for Isaiah, was the closest thing to godhood. By winter, his obsession had deepened. He studied livestock manuals, agricultural journals, breeding charts. If cattle could be improved through selection, why not men? The logic slid easily into his thoughts like a key fitting a lock. No one challenged him. The neighboring landowners admired his precision, his discipline. They saw only success, not the quiet madness building behind his calm eyes. Isaiah had learned long ago that evil performed neatly looks like virtue. One evening, his overseer, a man named Carter, entered the study. Carter was older, gray at the temples, loyal but wary. Isaiah asked him a question that froze the air between them. "What if we grew our own men?" Carter frowned. "You mean raise them young, train them early?" Isaiah smiled faintly. "I mean breed them, by our design under our hand. No purchases, no waste, a perfect cycle." The silence that followed felt endless. Carter said nothing. He looked away, perhaps realizing that in that moment he was hearing the birth of something monstrous. Yet he stayed, because men like him knew their survival depended on obedience. Isaiah began his plan the next morning. He reorganized housing, recorded ages, strengths, illnesses. Every man on his land became a line item. He moved through the quarters like an inspector, not a human being. He believed he was solving a problem, not creating one. And that belief, the quiet confidence of righteousness, made him unstoppable. History would later call it horror. Isaiah called it business. He built a small ledger titled Generational Yield. Every name he wrote carried a number beside it: projected value, physical potential, bloodline stability. He wasn't writing about people. He was designing a future. Carter tried to reason once. "Sir," he said, "there's a line between management and madness." Isaiah didn't answer. He only wrote another column labeled Projected Birth Cycle. The pencil moved like a blade across paper. By spring, he selected his first subjects: strong, young, compliant men. He recorded their traits, height, muscle density, endurance under heat. To Isaiah, they weren't victims. They were data. He believed he was creating order. Each night he stood on his porch, staring at the horizon. He told himself he was doing what progress demanded, that men who built empires had to step beyond morality, and he wanted his empire eternal. Carter began drinking more. He saw what Isaiah didn't: the hollow eyes of those reduced to experiments, the silence that filled the air after Isaiah's inspections. But silence, on plantations, was safety. A visiting merchant once asked Isaiah what separated him from other men. Isaiah answered simply, "They plant cotton, I plant legacy." The merchant laughed, not realizing he'd just heard the gospel of a tyrant. As the months passed, Isaiah's records grew thicker. He charted illnesses, mortality, productivity, and something new: conception success rates. He began cross-referencing, noting which pairings produced the strongest offspring. His tone in the margins was almost proud. Carter avoided his master's study. Inside, the walls smelled of ink, sweat, and the faint decay of parchment, the scent of a man rewriting the definition of humanity. Outside, the fields swayed, unaware of what they symbolized. By 1837, the plantation had changed. Isaiah's system was in motion. New cabins had been built, not for labor, but for what he called the breeding cycle. He spoke of it the way farmers spoke of harvests. Carter kept the books now. He didn't understand the numbers anymore. They weren't about profit or production. They were about lineage, male lines of endurance, strength, obedience. Isaiah was manufacturing bloodlines. Sometimes, at night, Carter thought about leaving. But where could he go? In the South, men didn't run from power. They bowed to it. Fear was as much currency as cotton. Isaiah wrote in his private notes, "Control the beginning, and you control the end." He had stopped seeing men altogether. They were a formula now, a means to an immortal equation. The overseer once found Isaiah in the stables, standing beside a horse he'd bred for speed. "Perfect symmetry," Isaiah murmured, running a hand along the animal's neck. Then softly, "If only all creation could be refined." Carter pretended not to hear. But that night, he couldn't sleep, because he realized Isaiah meant men. He meant to refine them, reshape them. And he'd already started. When Carter finally confronted him, Isaiah didn't raise his voice. "You mistake cruelty for creation," he said. "The world rewards those who can improve what others fear to touch." Then he smiled, thin, brittle, victorious. By 1840, his experiments had results. Infants born into bondage, cataloged, numbered. Isaiah's records were immaculate, his tone detached. Each child was a ledger entry, its value rising with the father's strength. Carter watched the plantation transform into a factory of men. There was no joy, no laughter, no prayer, only the rustle of chains and the steady scratching of Isaiah's pen. Occasionally, Isaiah would visit the quarters, studying the boys born from his system. He'd smile faintly and write, "Potential asset." He saw no humanity there, only progress. But beneath the silence, something began to stir, a quiet rage. The men he categorized were beginning to see through the numbers. They weren't property anymore. They were pressure, building towards something inevitable. Isaiah didn't notice. He was too busy perfecting his process, drafting new charts, predicting yields 5 years in advance. His plantation had become a laboratory, his soul an abacus. And then, one night in 1843, Carter heard the first whisper of rebellion. A single voice outside his window said, "The man who writes the names bleeds like the rest." It was both a warning and a prophecy. Isaiah slept peacefully that night, unaware that his perfect system had already cracked. The order he built from cruelty would soon face what no calculation could contain: the will of men who refused to be numbered. The morning fog rolled low over the Mississippi fields, muffling the sound of footsteps. Men moved through the rows like shadows, each one marked by the same silence that had built the Jessup Empire. Isaiah stood on the porch, his coat perfectly pressed, ledger in hand. Behind his calm eyes was a growing hunger, not for food but for efficiency, the kind that turned men into motion. He'd built the system. Now he would refine it. To Isaiah, the world was machinery. Every man a gear, every heartbeat a pulse in the engine of his prosperity. The plantation pulsed like a body. Carter, the overseer, watched with quiet dread. He knew that once a man saw people as tools, there was no way back. He'd seen Isaiah's obsession evolve, from profit to perfection to power itself. Each day began before dawn. Bells rang. Men rose from their bunks, marched to fields. There was no speech, no complaint. Silence had become part of survival, as familiar as breath. Isaiah tracked everything. Hours worked, pounds picked, injuries sustained. He found patterns in pain. To him, numbers didn't lie. They justified. If suffering created yield, then suffering was productivity. Carter wanted to believe this would pass, that Isaiah would tire of his cold arithmetic. But the plantation was no longer soil and cotton. It was an organism, breathing through fear. Each ledger entry grew more precise. Isaiah introduced classifications, strength grades, endurance codes, lineage markers. He believed he was creating science, though every line he wrote pushed humanity further from his vision. By 1845, the plantation's output had doubled. Merchants praised his brilliance. Politicians cited him as proof that Southern industry could outpace the North. Isaiah smiled politely and said nothing. The truth wasn't meant for them. At night, he walked among the quarters, notebook in hand, eyes sharp as knives. He studied the men, calculated their worth, imagined generations bred for endurance. He thought of himself as the architect of time. Carter followed once, unseen, and watched Isaiah writing beneath the lantern's dim glow. The light made his face look hollow, almost skeletal, like a man already haunted by what he hadn't yet admitted. Every 300 words a shift came, the kind only felt, not spoken. The men began to move differently. Their silence wasn't obedience anymore. It was calculation, a waiting storm. Isaiah mistook that silence for submission. He'd built his empire on control, never realizing control is a temporary illusion. He couldn't see the tension curling like smoke beneath his perfect system. One morning, Carter found a carved mark on a cabin wall, an X burned deep into the wood. Beneath it, the words, "He counts us, but not himself." It chilled him to his core. He didn't show Isaiah. He knew better. Isaiah would only analyze it, categorize rebellion as an anomaly, a statistical aberration, the kind of error that could be corrected through punishment. By summer, Isaiah began enforcing quotas. Any man who fell short faced public reckoning, a mark in the ledger and the sting of authority. To him, discipline was refinement. To others, it was hell. Carter saw one man, tall, scarred, eyes like steel, take the punishment without sound. His name was Abram. Isaiah wrote beside it, "Defiance potential, high." He circled the words twice. That night, the sound of thunder rolled in, distant but heavy. Carter couldn't tell if it was weather or warning. Men whispered in the dark, their breaths blending with the rumble of the coming storm. Isaiah didn't sleep. He stood by the window, watching the lightning flash over his land. In those moments, he felt something like pride, as if even nature acknowledged his dominion. But control invites rebellion. By autumn, small acts began, tools misplaced, rations missing, ledger pages torn. Isaiah saw these not as resistance, but as data, proof that unpredictability required stronger order. He introduced new overseers, men as cold as himself. They enforced silence with precision. But authority built from fear has cracks invisible to the powerful, cracks that grow louder in the dark. Carter drank more now. He couldn't stop hearing the whispers, stories of freedom spreading across counties, rumors of northern men challenging the system. Hope had a sound again, faint but persistent. One night, Isaiah called Carter into his study. The candle burned low, ledger open. "You've served well," Isaiah said softly. "But I sense hesitation. I need loyalty, not conscience." The words were a verdict. Carter bowed. "You have both, sir." But inside, his conviction was gone. He realized loyalty to a machine makes a man part of its gears, and gears, no matter how oiled, eventually grind down. Isaiah spent the following months obsessed with expansion. He bought more land, added more men, recorded more births. His vision had grown beyond a plantation. It was now a living engine. By 1848, visitors called it the Jessup machine. They marveled at its precision, its discipline. No one saw the exhaustion in the men's eyes or the quiet hatred that burned brighter than the torches at night. Carter began keeping his own secret notes, not ledgers, but names. He wrote them at night, every man he'd seen broken, everyone who'd stood tall despite it. It was his form of rebellion. Isaiah noticed his overseer's fatigue but ignored it. "Weak men don't build dynasties," he told himself. And yet, when he looked in the mirror, he saw fatigue staring back, the reflection of power devouring itself. The system no longer needed him to function. That realization came slowly. The ledgers ran themselves. The overseers enforced routine. The men labored on cue. Isaiah had created something self-sustaining, a beast that no longer required its creator. One evening, Carter approached the study door. Inside, he heard Isaiah talking to himself. "Perfect order, perfect lineage." The words were soft, rhythmic, obsessive. Carter turned away. Some machines consumed their makers. By 1850, the Jessup Plantation stretched miles wide, filled with men born into a system designed to erase individuality. Yet even in erasure, something human remained, defiance, flickering like embers beneath ash. Isaiah didn't see it. He was too lost in numbers, calculating the next decade's yields, the next generation's strength. He didn't know that every calculation has an error margin, and his was rebellion. Carter knew the storm was coming. You could smell it in the air like iron before lightning. The men weren't waiting for freedom anymore. They were preparing to take it. Isaiah closed his ledgers one night and felt for the first time a strange unease. The silence outside wasn't obedience anymore. It was breath, collective, controlled, and ready to strike. And when the first sound broke that silence, a hammer falling, a door splintering, a man shouting his own name, Isaiah realized what he had built was never a machine. It was resistance, disguised as order. The engine he designed had begun to turn against him, and in its grinding teeth, history was waiting to be rewritten, not in ink, but in blood. Rain hammered the roofs of the quarters, drumming like war. The men inside listened, not to weather, but to one another, to breaths, to plans, to the rhythm of something rising from despair. Isaiah Jessup sat in his office, staring at a damp ledger. The ink had bled, smearing the lines he'd built his empire upon. To him, even the rain felt like rebellion. The machine he'd created no longer obeyed. Production fell. Tools disappeared. Overseers whispered about unrest. Isaiah called it inefficiency. Carter, standing at the window, called it the beginning of consequence. Each morning, Isaiah inspected the men himself, eyes sharp, coat immaculate. He spoke softly, but the silence afterward spoke louder, the kind that only happens when fear has lost its grip. The fields moved slower now. The men worked, but their pace had changed. It wasn't fatigue, it was defiance disguised as labor, patience shaped by fury waiting for its hour. Carter felt it too. He'd spent years enforcing order, but the air had turned thick with something ancient, the kind of silence before a storm that doesn't pass quietly. Isaiah increased surveillance, added patrols, tightened rations. He believed control restored faith. But the human heart doesn't bend forever. It memorizes cruelty, and one day it demands its own reckoning. In the distance, thunder rolled. Isaiah misread it as weather again. He couldn't imagine nature conspiring with men he'd counted as property. But storms don't ask permission. They arrive, uninvited and undeniable. Carter found Abram sharpening a rusted tool behind the stables. Their eyes met. No words, only acknowledgement. Carter didn't stop him. He understood. Every man has a limit, and Abram's had passed. That night, lightning split the sky, turning the fields to silver. The men didn't sleep. They sat in silence, watching flashes reveal faces hardened by endurance. Freedom had a scent. Wet earth and gunpowder. Isaiah stayed awake, reviewing numbers that no longer mattered. His ledgers were immaculate, but the world beyond his window had become unreadable. Even perfection cannot bind the will of men forever. Carter walked the grounds, lantern trembling in his hand. He felt eyes on him, dozens of them, watching, waiting. He knew he was no longer feared. He was merely tolerated. By dawn, one overseer was missing. His rifle lay in the mud, boots still beside it. Isaiah called it an accident. Carter said nothing. He'd stopped believing in accidents months ago. Isaiah assembled everyone at sunrise, his voice cutting through mist. "There is order here," he said. "There will always be order." But the crowd of men said nothing, their stares cold as iron. Carter stood behind him, hearing the lie echo. He realized Isaiah wasn't speaking to them. He was pleading with himself, trying to hold together a world that had already fractured. The day unfolded like ritual. Fields, sweat, silence. Yet beneath the rhythm, something pulsed. Unity. Men who had been counted like livestock now moved with purpose, each glance another spark in the dark. Isaiah's youngest overseer reported whispers of escape routes, of northern scouts. Isaiah dismissed them as fantasy. He didn't understand. Fantasy is where revolutions begin, growing in the cracks of reality. Carter found more carvings, not X this time, but circles, endless, unbroken, a symbol of what Isaiah couldn't control, connection. The men were no longer individuals. They were a single will. By late summer, tension had teeth. Fights broke out among overseers, blame spreading faster than disease. Isaiah's leadership faltered, his certainty eroded by fear he refused to name. He drank now, quietly, alone. Each sip was an argument with his conscience, one he lost nightly. Even tyrants need illusion, and Isaiah's illusion was collapsing with every missing tool, every vanished man. Carter heard singing one night, low, steady, rhythmic. It wasn't a song of sorrow, but of defiance. The sound crawled through the darkness like fire, reaching every cabin. It was the sound of awakening. Isaiah stormed from his house, shouting for silence, but the song didn't stop. It grew, dozens of voices, male and unyielding, echoing across the fields. For the first time, he heard fear in his own breath. The next morning, work halted. No orders, no compliance. Men stood in lines, silent but immovable. Isaiah approached, eyes blazing. Abram stepped forward. No weapon, only will. Two men, one truth between them. Isaiah raised his cane. Abram didn't flinch. Carter watched, knowing this moment would define them all. The cane trembled, then lowered. Control had left Isaiah's hand, and he felt it like a wound. For days, the plantation froze. No cotton picked, no words exchanged. The air itself seemed to wait. Rebellion didn't always need fire. Sometimes refusal was enough to burn a kingdom down. Isaiah's ledgers became useless. He stared at blank pages, unable to record obedience that no longer existed. Numbers can't measure defiance. The ink refused to move. The empire had stopped breathing. Carter knew what would come. When power is cornered, it strikes. He warned the men quietly, told them to hide what they could, be ready. Freedom always costs, and the bill was coming due. That night, torches flared in the rain. Overseers stormed the quarters, shouting orders drowned by thunder. But the men didn't run. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of flesh and fury. Isaiah arrived too late. He saw the flames consuming his fields, the smoke twisting into the night like vengeance made visible. His voice broke, swallowed by wind and the roar of collapse. Carter dragged him back toward the house. "You built this!" he shouted. Isaiah didn't reply. His eyes reflected the fire, not horror, not grief, just realization. The machine had finally eaten its master. By dawn, half the plantation was ash. Rain fell softly now, washing soot into the earth. The men stood watching, soaked but unbroken. No cheers, only quiet. The sound of something ending, something beginning. Isaiah sat beneath the porch, trembling. His hands, once steady with ink, couldn't hold the pen. The empire of numbers was gone, replaced by the weight of what those numbers had done. Carter left that morning, walking into mist. He didn't know where the road led, only that staying meant complicity. Behind him, the plantation smoked, an epitaph written in the ruins of greed. Isaiah looked across the empty fields, the charred remains of his order. For the first time, he saw men, not property, not yield, but men. And that sight broke him more completely than fire ever could. Smoke still hung over the valley when dawn crept across the ruined plantation. The air tasted of iron and memory. Men stood among the ashes, their faces carved with disbelief and silent relief. Isaiah Jessup sat alone on the porch, wrapped in a gray coat stiff with rain. His empire had burned overnight, leaving only ledgers and ghosts. For the first time, he looked small. Carter returned at sunrise, boots heavy with mud. He had walked for miles but couldn't escape the pull of the land that made him complicit. He stopped at the gate, unsure why he'd come back. The plantation was unrecognizable. Charred fences, broken tools, collapsed barns. The great house still stood, though hollowed by smoke. The silence carried more weight than any sermon ever could. Isaiah looked up as Carter approached. No words passed between them. They both understood. What had been created in greed had been destroyed by its own reflection. The machine had devoured itself completely. Inside the house, the ledgers remained untouched. The fire hadn't reached Isaiah's study. Stacks of paper sat on his desk, each page neatly labeled, the proof of a system that had turned men into fractions. Carter opened one book. The ink was perfect, the handwriting flawless. He read aloud a name, then another, each followed by a number. The sound broke him. Numbers had outlived the men they measured. Isaiah stared at the floor. "They were records," he whispered. "Nothing more." Carter shut the ledger gently, the sound echoing like judgment. "They were lives," he said, "and you can't balance that kind of debt." Outside, the men who remained gathered by the river. None spoke. They watched the current carry soot downstream, as if washing away the evidence of the years stolen from them. Isaiah wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came. Power gives language. Guilt takes it. He sat in silence, feeling the weight of every entry he had written pressing on his chest. Carter moved through the remains of the fields. The soil was blackened, yet underneath green shoots had already begun to rise. Life, he thought, always finds a way through ruin, even after tyranny. The men built small fires that night. They didn't celebrate. They simply sat together, sharing warmth. Freedom was too heavy to carry alone, but together it began to feel real. Isaiah stayed in his study, candlelight flickering across the ledgers. He opened one and began crossing out names one by one. The ink bled, but it didn't erase the memory. Carter watched through the window. He saw a man crumbling beneath the truth he'd written himself into. Guilt was no redemption, but it was the beginning of understanding. By morning, Isaiah's hands were black with ink. He had tried to destroy the records, but stopped halfway through. Destroying proof would mean pretending it never happened, and he no longer had the right to forget. The men began leaving in groups, north, west, anywhere that wasn't here. They carried nothing but names, their own, their brothers', their fathers'. For the first time, they chose direction instead of obedience. Carter stayed behind until the last man was gone. He watched the trail fade into the horizon, feeling something like pride. Men who once counted days now counted distance. That was freedom. Isaiah stepped outside, leaning heavily on the porch rail. "They'll survive," Carter said quietly. Isaiah nodded, eyes empty. "Better than I deserve." He looked toward the empty fields and saw the ghost of his own ambition. The days blurred into weeks. The plantation decayed faster without hands to tend it. Windows shattered, roofs sagged, weeds overtook the paths once kept straight by fear. Nature was reclaiming what man had corrupted. Carter spent his hours sorting through what remained. He found tools, chains, coins, nothing of value, except one small notebook. Inside were calculations that ended mid-line, as if the author had finally run out of purpose. Isaiah's health began to fail. He ate little, spoke less. He spent his days staring at the ledgers, not reading, just listening to the silence between their pages. It was the only punishment he would ever face. Carter stayed, not out of loyalty, but duty to truth. Someone had to witness the end. Empires don't vanish quietly. They rot, whispering apologies too late for anyone to hear. In early autumn, Isaiah died at his desk, slumped over the open ledger. His pen rested beside the word total. There was no sum. Some debts refused to be calculated. Carter buried him at the edge of the field beneath an oak. No marker, no ceremony, just soil and silence. The man who once counted others was finally uncounted himself. Winter came, wrapping the ruins in frost. The wind howled through empty halls, scattering ashes like pages. Carter remained in the caretaker's cottage, waiting for something he couldn't name. Perhaps absolution. In spring, strangers arrived from the north. Scholars, historians, men with questions. They found the ledgers untouched, sealed in a trunk. Carter watched them load the papers carefully, their faces pale as they read. One of them asked his name. "Just Carter," he said. He didn't tell them he'd once been the hand behind the order, the eye that watched silence bloom into revolt. Some truths live only in memory. Years later, the ledgers reached archives far from Mississippi. Scholars called them the Jessup documents. To Carter, they were tombstones made of ink, each page a confession from a world built on cruelty. He lived long enough to see the plantation collapse into dust. Grass grew over the paths, trees split through the stone steps. Nature erased the lines Isaiah once drew to divide men. On his final morning, Carter stood where the house had been. The air smelled clean again. "It's over," he said softly. not to anyone, but to the ghosts that lingered in the soil. When he died, they buried him beside the oak. 2 graves, unmarked, facing the river. The land was quiet, and for the first time in decades, peace didn't feel like absence. It felt like truth. Decades later, boys exploring the woods would find fragments of ledgers near the stream, names still legible, ink stubborn against time. They'd wonder who these men were and why no one remembered them. History would call Isaiah Jessup a monster, Carter a witness, the men he oppressed survivors. But the land itself carried the deeper story, of systems collapsing, of silence breaking, of men reclaiming breath. And as the sun set over the reclaimed fields, the wind carried one final echo, the whisper of numbers fading into names, names fading into legend, legend fading into the quiet dignity of remembrance.